Welcome to the program. I'm David Speers. The way we access information and entertainment has changed rapidly in recent years. The words Twitter, app, live streaming, iPad would have meant very little a decade ago, but now it's the talk of the town. The media landscape is changing very rapidly indeed. The question is, are the rules governing the media keeping up? Well, the government is due to announce shortly changes to the media landscape and how it's ruled. It follows the recommendations of what's called the Convergence Review, which spent a year looking at these changes in the media landscape. We've brought together a range of experts to explore these issues, journalists, academics and the chair of the Convergence Review as well. To kick things off, though, we're going to start by looking at what these changes have meant for journalists and for consumers. George Negus, well-known reporter and writer. George, what have been the biggest changes in recent years in the media landscape from your perspective?
Easy question, David. First up. I guess you'd have to say the fact that we now have an old media and a new media is the biggest change that's happened. And I'm tempted to say that it's a bit like parallel universes, the old media and the new media, and where journalists and the media itself fits into that. But I'm more inclined to suggest that they're not parallel universes. It's a tangential sort of universe with the new media flying off the old media, or is the old media clinging to the new media as it takes off?
And journalists have a foot really in a lot of them.
We don't know where we stand.
Both camps.
We don't know where we stand.
I mean, as a journalist, you might be, working in the old media per se, anchoring a show or filing for a TV network, but you might also be on Twitter and everything else, pumping out information that way.
Whether you like it or not.
Whether you like it or not.
And I think that's the biggest factor, that what we did before was confined to the organisation or the outlet that we work for, even the part of the media that we work for. Now you never know where you're going to end up, which is why you have to watch your personal and your political and your professional PMQ.
Quentin Dempster, ABC journalist and presenter of 7:30 in New South Wales. Is journalism any better or worse now than it was, say, 10 or 20 years ago?
Well, it's the digital revolution, as George has indicated, and that's changing the nature of print, because you can access on your broadband internet, you can access The Guardian, the New York Times, the Los Angeles newspapers, any print from around the world, and you can beam your TV at your Wi-Fi, and you can download television and audio. So it smashes national boundaries. We're desperately concerned about print, of course, in this country and in the United States. We want it to survive the digital revolution, and we want to see that the quality public benefits of journalism, investigative journalism, holding power to account, can be enhanced. Now, we're in a state of flux at the moment. We want to make sure that journalism survives the process.
Richard Ackland, a columnist with the Sydney Morning Herald, former presenter of Media Watch, one of the biggest changes has been that print outlets are now online in a big way and producing a lot of TV-like services. You can watch videos and clips and all sorts of TV services on the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian's website. And vice versa, a lot of TV networks have online presence as well that involves a lot of what would normally be print-like journalism. This is crossover.
Yes, well, this is the convergence that's happening right before our eyes. And I think sort of subtly and progressively, old print companies, old newspaper companies are quietly converting themselves into digital companies. It'll be one body of journalists doing work for both print and online. The content will be streamed or slurried through different sort of pipelines and platforms and arrive at its destination. But basically, I think you'll see really quite quickly in this country that the old newspaper publishers will become digital companies.
And will the weekday print editions disappear?
Well, that's been happening in America. Some of the cities in America have gone to 2 days a week print. With the, New Orleans has just gone to 3 days a week. I think it's only paper, and so these are dramatic changes. And people, I think Warren Buffett the other day, who owns a lot of newspapers in America actually, including the majority shareholder in the Washington Post. But he's saying we just got to get used to the idea. People aren't going to newspapers to get their share prices anymore or their all the sort of daily little bits and pieces of information that you used to rely on in a newspaper, that's all online. Newspapers have got to do something else.
Helen Daly, our very own Sky News journalist and anchor, how do you think all of this change has changed the role of the journalist? Does it mean more pressure to break news faster, get things to where perhaps without the accuracy and the checking that needs to go into it?
Well, I think before we can talk about that, I think what we've all been talking about is as if it's an industry. It's still an industry that is controlled. You know, there are the bosses and the proprietors at the top, and then there are working journalists whose salaries are paid. It's sort of not anymore. It's so amorphous and it's organically changing so much that Joe and Jane blogs, who are bloggers or Twitterers or tweeters, I'm never sure what that is, or take part in a forum that's online somewhere or respond to some story, they are also forming part of this. We don't control it anymore. So back to your question, that's changed, and also I think it probably still and perhaps does put a greater pressure on working journalists who are employed and who operate mostly under a code of ethics, be it the journalistic code of ethics or having been a broadcast journalist. I've worked forever on television under various codes and regulations that broadcast media is under. The onus is always on us to do the best, the most accurate, the most truthful, the fairest that we can do. Whether we're always going to get it right, because there are these other people putting stuff out there that you think, well, if something's on a tweet, how do I quickly verify whether that's right and put it to air?
A lot of them couldn't spell the word accurate. A lot of the people who are using the new media, totally unqualified to do what we think we're qualified to do, we don't know really what's out there. So it's not so much a new media, but a new mess.
But the politicians are into this in a big way too. I mean, Joel Fitzgibbon over the weekend responded to the Sunday newspaper reports that he's canvassing for return to Kevin Rudd on Twitter. He did it on Twitter. All right, well, let's bring in Glenn Boreham. He's the chair of the Convergence Review. What's wrong with the current regulatory environment? What's the media getting away with that they shouldn't be?
Well, it's not a matter of what they're getting away with. We've really teed it up. You know, Quinton touched on what is convergence, this phenomenon of almost any media to any device. On a tablet PC or on a smartphone, I can watch video, I can listen to radio, I can read the newspaper. And then George talked about this divergence between old media and new media, and basically the way that the government regulate is based on the old structures, which happens to be how a product, how media content is delivered, rather than what it does. And because of that, as more and more of our media is delivered via new platforms, the existing regulations will become increasingly irrelevant.
Give us a practical example then of how something in this new media landscape won't be properly regulated under the old regulatory structure.
So historically, broadcast, radio and television has been quite heavily regulated in Australia on a historical basis of using scarce public spectrum to broadcast a signal. The reality of today is a new entrant could come into Australia, start a television station that, for all intents and purposes, looked and felt like Channel 7, 9 or 10. It looked like a Foxtel subscription channel. And because they happen to deliver their content via the internet, they're outside of almost all regulation. They're outside of content standards, they're outside of Australian content obligations, and largely outside of ownership restrictions.
All right. Well, before we get to what you've recommended, let's bring in Julian Disney, the chair of the Australian Press Council. Do you think there's anything wrong with the current environment? Do you agree there is a case for updating, for improving the way the changing landscape is ruled?
Oh yes, firstly we've got to have more consistency. It's not only just, for example, the case where, let's say, the Channel 10 News is also running on a newspaper website. That's relatively easy to work out a way of dealing with that, get the same regulator to deal with it wherever it is. But
which they don't at the moment.
No, but there's still a problem of someone saying exactly the same thing in print as they or someone else has said on television, let's say.
Because a lot of people won't know this, but there are very different ways of dealing with broadcast and print.
Yes, I mean, as Glenn said, the broadcast system is much more statutory, much more detailed. The print system, by and large, has been self-regulation, although the Press Council has got a significant element of independence in it, not widely known and perhaps not utilised as much as it should have been, but it has got the seeds of a good independent approach. The challenge now, of course, and what Glenn was facing is how do we bring these two very different systems together? And the proposals that he made, I think, are pretty much in the right direction, and they're ones that
we'll
the Press
get
Council
to those proposals in just a tick, but I want to bring in John Roskin, the head of the Institute of Public Affairs. This talk of a new regulatory environment, you think we should go in the other direction?
Well, much of the regulation that Glenn and Julian are talking about, I don't think we need anymore. It's a throwback to the 50s. The idea that media magnates do deal with prime ministers and therefore we have these ownership restrictions, they can go. The content restrictions, they can go. We've talked about changes to the media and journalism. We have a wonderful democratisation of the media. Anyone can blog in their pyjamas, in their slippers in the middle of the night and bring down a president. That's wonderful. We have more commentary, more news than ever before. And what I'm concerned about is all of these ideas about regulation, standards, ethics are going to restrict, ultimately, freedom of speech.
Paul Jones, Associate Professor of Media and Cultural Sociology at the University of New South Wales. Get rid of all regulation? What do you think about that idea?
Most regulation.
Most regulation.
It's been a utopian fantasy for about 30 years that those kinds of arguments have been made. With all due respect to the Convergence review, Convergence is the most intellectually over-anticipated technological change in human history. We've had 30 years to think about it. And the old view used to be that spectrum scarcity, the rationale for the broadcast regulation we've got, which is nowhere near as great as people have said, would become irrelevant, and that the model of newspaper regulation should be spread to all the platforms. I think what the program we've just broken into is introducing to us is a quite different idea, which is the possibility that the broadcast standards that have been developed well in some countries, particularly Britain, might be highly applicable across all the platforms.
So you're saying the current broadcast regulation, the Communications and Media Authority, that could be extended simply to
I think this is the way the Brits are heading. I think if you look at Leveson's website, it's fairly clear that the kinds of questions he's asking for the next module, as they call it, the next round of questions they're going to ask, has a lot to do with the model of broadcast regulation in Britain. Whether you'd want to build on the broadcast regulation of journalism in Australia, I don't think that's really worth talking about.
Well, let's get to what Glenn Boreham has recommended in the Convergence review. You're saying a government regulator that covers all outlets, print, online, radio, TV, but not news and commentary. That would be an industry body looking at just news and commentary.
That's correct. We were faced with quite a stark decision. As you've pointed out, today there's a line blurred between a newspaper where you go in, there's a print article and there's a video clip attached to it, or you go to the website of this channel and you'll have the video of this program with a print article. So where do these lines start and finish? So we said news and commentary is news and commentary irrespective of how it's delivered. David Speers talking on television or David Speers writing an opinion piece in the paper shouldn't be, if you're going to regulate, to come to John's point, it shouldn't be regulated differently, which it is today. So today print is self-regulation, broadcast is government regulation. So we had a fork in the road. Do you move print up into the government, which is the recommendation across, or do you move news and commentary in radio and TV down into the industry? And that's what we decided to do. We thought it was a deregulatory step to say move it all into the one place. There's no longer a differentiation in a converged world, and let the industry decide.
Chris Merritt, the Legal Affairs Editor at the Australian newspaper, do you agree that this is a deregulatory step, what the Convergence review has put forward?
Broadly, I've got a couple of pretty important reservations though. I'm worried about the public interest test on mergers. I mean, I can't see how that's anything but a political test. Who's going to apply it and what are the criteria? Why not have something a little bit more specific? But broadly, I think it's the way to go. Print media, there was no logic in licensing print media. The logic in regulating electronic media was that bandwidth was limited. And if you apply that to print media, it just doesn't make sense.
Well, I want to get to this issue of ownership a little later, and whether we do have too much concentration or there is enough diversity in our media ownership in this country. But looking at the model that you've put forward to specifically cover news and commentary, this industry appointed body, there has been some concern about it. Kim Williams, the head of News Limited, his initial response was that this is a threat to press freedom because it contains government oversight of print, which currently doesn't exist. He's pointed in particular at the fact that there will still be this government regulator which can ask the industry body covering news and commentary to launch investigations. Is that right?
So in all respect to Kim, the initial coverage of our report was wrong. I mean, there was an article in The Australian that said we were recommending a retired judge with the ability to fine the print press. And then it was, well, no, that's not there. It's a 200-page document. The word fine doesn't appear anywhere in it. Then it was, well, there's the ability of oversight. These two bodies are separate bodies that sit on the same level together. There's the government regulator responsible for things like classification, children's content, making sure the Australian content obligations are met. And then there is an independent industry body for news and content, news and commentary standards. The idea of being able to ask was a very simple one, and that was this. Today, in the broadcast news environment, many consumers do not know where to complain. If I have an issue with something I see on the screen, do I go to the outlet? Do I go to the industry association? Do I go to my local member? Where do I go? So all we were suggesting was that as these new bodies are implemented, there may be a period where it actually creates more confusion and a consumer with a complaint may go to the government body mistakenly, and they should be able to pass them on and say, you're the industry body, we've received 100 complaints overnight.
But there are other links between the two bodies, this industry body you've suggested and the government body, which is clearly what media companies are worried about, the government body. You say in the report that the news standards body, the industry body, should be able to refer to the communications regulator instances where there have been persistent or serious breaches of the media code. So it can call in this government body.
And these were recommendations put to us by the existing news regulator, being the Press Council. So what we wanted to do was give the industry the option. So on one hand, you could argue the industry may come together in this self-regulatory body and say, we would like the opportunity as a last resort. If there is a member that is recalcitrant, if there's a member that is making us collectively look bad, and we've exhausted all options, they could refer to the government. But the important point, and the one that's been missed, is that is a matter for the new body. When it comes together, it will set its constitution, it will set its codes, and it will set its practices. And if the industry says, we were given the opportunity to refer, but collectively we do not want to use that, it is a matter
But it is a power you think should be there. Quentin Dempster, do you think that's a threat to free press?
I think we've got to be very careful. The media and our practices are under grave question now by the public after the News of the World phone hacking scandal, and other instances may emerge. So we've got to be very careful about this. The journalists of Australia have supported self-regulation since the formation of the Australian Press Council in 1975, and we're very concerned about the loss of self-regulation if there was a statutory regulator. So we've got to see how, if the government responds to Glenn Boram's recommendation with this, what you call the two-tier system, we've got to see exactly what the fine print is.
About the connection between these two bodies.
About that connection, because as everybody's acknowledged, broadcast media, radio, TV, has been regulated since the start of radio in the 1920s and has all the way through. Print has never been regulated. This is why it's called freedom of the press.
But on the face of what Glenn just told us about where there's a recalcitrant media company that's not following the code, you can refer this, call in the government regulator.
You're asking me for... no, I'd be very concerned about that.
I would be too, as a working journalist. I think that's, that sounds like the long arm of government coming right in there.
I mean, there's no
And
difference.
how is that independent?
But the point being, we have proposed that be a decision for the industry. So the industry comes together. It sets up its own self-regulation. It sets up its
industry-led body.
The industry-led body. It sets up its constitution.
Industry-led or profession-led? I mean, we're talking about two things here. We're talking about ownership on the one hand and practitioners on the other. I mean, journalists are quite capable of self-censoring. They don't need a regulatory body to do it for themselves. They work out who they're working for, how far they can go, how far they can't go.
If you've got a nervous Nelly as an editor, it wouldn't publish something.
But there's another thing we're missing here, David. We're missing out on three things. One, readers. Two, listeners. And three, viewers.
I agree with that.
And if they were listening to what we're talking about now, they wouldn't know what we were talking about. The very words convergence and regulator would scare the living daylights out of most people out there.
If I can pick up...
So convergence means control, regulation
just on that, pick up on that point, because it comes back to John's comment about we should just deregulate. You would think there is only one audience here, and that is the industry itself. And what we learned during the year, during the Convergence Review, we actually did a road trip right around Australia. We went to regional centres, we went to all the metropolitan centres, and there is another constituency involved here, and that's the Australian public. And we heard loud and clear three things. The Australian public do want diversity of ownership. They are concerned about concentration. They do want minimum community standards. So you don't want pornography at the extreme made available to children. And they do want Australian content in their media. So, it's easy to say we just want to deregulate everything and drop all the barriers.
Well, this might be a good point to bring in David Vaile from the Australian Privacy Foundation. What do you think, from that privacy perspective, people are most worried about when they see the way the media is operating at the moment?
I think one of the problems is the sort of blurring of the idea between what's in the public interest, an investigative story that's in the public interest, and what the public might be interested in. And unfortunately, the latter often stoops pretty low. It's down there with the underwear sniffing at the worst case. And if you have members of the profession or segments of the industry that are prepared to go around sort of sticking doors in, sort of poor single mother of two sort of front door, just to basically to pillory them, I think a lot of people feel like, well, why isn't something done to stop that?
So you would welcome some government oversight or greater government oversight of the media?
I'm not sure whether government oversight is really the question here. I think there's very much a self-interested, self-referential sort of tone to this sort of discussion. If you actually get out there with the broader population, they'll be thinking things like, is there a right to free speech in Australia? And basically there's not. Maybe as part of this package, that question should be answered. People sort of work in a dreamland as if we're in America. We have this First Amendment. Well, hello, what? There's very little protection there.
I think once we get into a Bill of Rights, that's probably a conversation for another time. But...
Well, it's part of the same sort of package, though, because the other side of that would be, a right to privacy, not in sort of in every circumstances, not if you're trying to hide sort of, gross misdeeds behind that, not if you're trying to shuck responsibility, but, if it's at the worst case someone is just hounding you and they've decided to make you a figure of public pillorying, should you have that? And it seems to me that although the MPs and much of industry doesn't like the idea of people having rights to free speech or people having rights to privacy, that may actually make a lot of the concern about government regulation go away. If the media in the context of dealing with public interest stories, proper investigation, or even stuff that's on the margin has a right to free speech, and if individuals have a right, in the extreme case, to protect their privacy, then that's the sort of framework within this which this other stuff becomes a lot less dramatic.
I wanted to get back to exploring this issue of the government having potentially some role through this government body you've recommended over media misbehaviour. We're going to take a quick break, come back and explore that, whether we do have anything to fear from that.